ABC, this is World News Tonight with Max Robinson in Chicago. Tonight, another in our series of special assignment reports on America's military strength. Is it second to none? Barbara Walters reports on her conversation with Johnny Carson. And from our desk in Washington, Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. Federal officials said today the United States is now suffering from an epidemic of traffic deaths, that we are killing one another on the streets and highways in record numbers. Here's the story from Charles Gibson.
Logged 1.5 trillion miles on the highway last year, and almost 140 people are killed in their cars every day. Yearly traffic fatalities have been on the rise since 1975. Over 50,000 people were killed last year, and this year's numbers are also up sharply.
What these statistics tell us is that the number of persons being killed in traffic accidents is increasing at a faster rate than the number of registered vehicles, than the number of miles traveled, than the drivers licensed in the U.S. population.
The reasons? Speed is number one, and the 55-mile limit is the key. Traffic deaths are up most dramatically in the West, where the 55-mile-an-hour limit is most widely ignored, but unchanged in the Northeast, where it is most widely observed. Number two, safety regulations. 26 states have now repealed mandatory motorcycle helmet laws. As a result, motorcycle deaths are up 41% since 1975. Vans and pickups are the latest fad. Safety requirements in such vehicles are not as stringent as in the passenger car. Crash tests show steering columns can hit the driver right in the neck in head-on collisions. And van and pickup fatalities are up 37%. And number three, seat belts. Americans don't use them. Only 14% of the people on the road are belted in. So many deaths are preventable. Federal officials figure if everyone wore seat belts or motorcycle helmets or stuck to 55 miles an hour, as many as 20,000 lives a year might be saved. Charles Gibson, ABC News, Washington.
The National Transportation Safety Board announced its decision today on the cause of last September's crash in San Diego of PSA Flight 182 after a collision with a small Cessna aircraft. That was a crash in which 144 people were killed, the worst airline disaster in this country's history. Science editor Jules Bergman has this report.
It was the nation's worst single air disaster, killing 144 persons. The lengthy investigation that followed revealed major problems with the air traffic control system. But today, the National Transportation Safety Board, after heated debate, placed the blame on the PSA flight crew. The Safety Board called poor performance by the PSA pilots the probable cause of the crash, finding they did not maintain proper vigilance and failed to keep track of the small Cessna. A contributing factor, the board declared, was faulty air traffic procedures, allowing the controller to use visual separation. The board discussed but rejected a staff report that the Cessna's failure to keep to its assigned course contributed to the crash. At first, the Federal Aviation Administration denied its airport procedures were a factor in the accident, but the FAA has since installed altitude radar in the San Diego Tower. Jules Bergman, ABC News, reporting.
ABC's World News Tonight, brought to you by Shake and Bake for delicious chicken. Shake and Bake coating mix, regular or barbecue style. They make the most of your chicken.
A passenger train headed from New York to Washington ran head-on into a maintenance train in a small town just outside New York City today. Bob Brown has that story.
On a stretch of track near a suburban neighborhood, the Metroliner with 200 passengers on board barreled into a 32-ton maintenance train. The engine on the passenger train burst into flames.
With just one awful roar and everything went flying. The seats came off the floor, luggage going all over the place. I looked out the window and there was nothing but fire, roaring flames.
The crew on the maintenance unit saw the train coming and jumped clear, but more than 70 people on board the train were hurt. The first thought of some of the passengers was that the train had hit a truck. What they didn't know was that one Amtrak vehicle had struck another Amtrak vehicle, and one of them was obviously in the wrong place. There's been a lot of maintenance work on the tracks between New York and Washington recently, but officials on the scene refuse to talk about what may have gone wrong.
Is there anybody from Amtrak who can get off the railroad?
One source at Amtrak was quoted as saying the train was apparently diverted to another track that wasn't supposed to be used. James and Margaret Conine were on their way to Washington for a vacation this weekend, and they had taken the train because of concern over an air crash in New Jersey earlier this week.
just didn't expect it. In fact, we didn't fly because of the helicopter and, you know, the crash up at Newark. So we decided we'd take the train.
The Conines and other shaken passengers finally continued toward their destinations this afternoon by bus. Bob Brown, ABC News, Edison, New Jersey.
There are thousands of people evacuated from their homes across the country tonight, from North Dakota and Minnesota to Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. They're victims of especially severe annual spring floods. Some of the worst of the flooding today inundated parts of Houston, where Bob Serkin filed this report.
It began as just another April shower, but minute by minute the rain fell over Houston harder and harder and harder. 7 inches of rain in 3 hours. It came during the height of Houston's traffic rush hour. This city, whose lifeline is its vast freeway system, was brought to a soggy standstill. 6 feet of water and mud stranded over 5,000 homeward-bound motorists. Many abandoned their cars and some of their clothes and headed for higher ground.
Yeah, I've been trying to get my wife. We can't get it on the line, the phone's out, everything. Bye. I hope my insurance covers that.
This morning, the water began subsiding, but the freeways were still jammed and residential and business districts still flooded. The overflowing San Jacinto River has also flooded suburbs north of Houston. Here in Conroe, 14 inches of rain fell within 8 hours. 50 houses in this exclusive subdivision are submerged. Residents here just barely beat the rapidly rising waters in making their escapes. Back in Houston, it's raining again, and there are new problems on the freeways. Tonight, the Houston area weather forecast includes another flash flood watch. Bob Serkin, ABC News, Houston.
This is Charles Murphy in Nederland, Texas. Those Texas thunderstorms are credited with sinking a big oil tanker. The 100,000-ton Sea Tiger was hit by lightning and caught on fire, and it took nearly 6 hours to control the flames, which fed mostly off the tanker's own fuel. The Sea Tiger was empty. It had just unloaded 500,000 barrels of crude oil and was taking on ballast. 1 crew member was killed. Another 30 were taken to hospitals, though only 15 were admitted. This morning, the deck was still hot from the fire down inside. The hull was nearly torn in two. Some oil got into the Neches River, but it is not a large spill. This was an extremely unusual occurrence. The odds against it happening, thousands to 1. And not much can be done to prevent this sort of thing. Charles Murphy, ABC News, Nederland, Texas.
Wednesday night, 3 people were killed and 15 injured in the crash of a Sikorsky S-61 helicopter at Newark Airport. A crack found in the rear rotor blade is believed responsible for the crash. Now the National Transportation Safety Board is urging that all Sikorsky S-61 civilian helicopters be grounded. While there are only 12 other such choppers in use, there are hundreds of military models, among them President Carter's. The White House officials say Marine One has a completely different rear assembly and will not be grounded. The possibility of what would happen in another plane crash, a crash involving nuclear weapons, is the subject of a massive military exercise today in the Southwest. Bill Worden was there as the tests began.
This is Nellis Tower. Los Angeles Center has just informed us they lost radar contact with MAC SAM 1213. They've lost radar contact and fear a possible crash.
That's how the exercise began. The plane crash was simulated on government land 100 miles north of Las Vegas, using parts of an old aircraft. Scattered throughout the wreckage were old nuclear weapons. The stress was on reality. Responding to the mayday, disaster teams by the plane load began flying into Nellis Air Force Base. Among them, a heavily armed unit of Air Force police. In a real disaster, there would be an urgent need to seal off the crash site, not only to protect people from radiation, but also to guard the vital nuclear weapons. Officials are deeply concerned that at times like this, nuclear weapons are most vulnerable to terrorists.
Today, with all the nuclear disaster teams in place, the real purpose of this exercise begins. A slow, painstaking search of this wreckage behind me and the general area. News cameras are allowed no closer than this because there is radiation out there, and because actual nuclear weapons are scattered throughout the wreckage.
The search teams, wearing heavy clothing and masks to protect them from radiation, moved into the wreckage to look for survivors, represented by mannequins, and to find scattered weapons. Helicopters were used to monitor radioactivity, and it was there, given off by a radium solution sprayed over the crash. The conditions at the crash site were based on actual crashes of nuclear bombers in Greenland and Spain. In all, more than 500 civilian and military experts are here. They have never held a test like this before, and they're already discovering they have too many people here, and they're having equipment problems. It all cost more than $1.5 million, and it took 2 years to plan, so it is merely coincidence that this nuclear disaster exercise occurs within a period of increased awareness of nuclear hazards. Bill Werdum, ABC News, at the Nevada test site.
Temperatures inside the cooling system at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant have dropped below the boiling point for the first time since the accident on March 28th. Temperatures in the damaged uranium core are also dropping, but nuclear regulatory officials can't say when a cold shutdown will be reached. And there are still traces of radioactive iodine escaping from the plant. Officials are searching for the cause. Frank?
Leaders of the United Rubber Workers Union said today they have decided not to call a strike at midnight tonight when their contracts with 4 major rubber companies expire. Negotiations will be resumed on Monday. The union and the administration are in a battle over the president's wage price guidelines, which the union says it will not observe. Here's a report from Herbert Kaplow.
The folks who make rubber rarely make headlines, but by the accident of timing, they're the newest test of the Carter wage guidelines. 55,000 employees of Goodyear, Goodrich, Uniroyal, Firestone. Their current contracts expire at midnight tonight. Average pay at the moment, $8 an hour, plus about $4 in other benefits. Not nearly enough, they say. President Carter's 7% isn't nearly enough. And besides, says Union President Peter Bomarito, guidelines are a sham anyway.
It's anybody that says there's guidelines is talking through their hat. If you will look at the inflation and have somebody say that there's guidelines, it just don't make sense.
But at the White House, the guidelines policy is being pursued. Company representatives from the rubber industry heard about it today from presidential advisors. Bomarito had been invited to another such meeting. He accepted but didn't come. Later, the president's chief inflation fighter, Alfred Kahn, reviewed what he had told the rubber executives and what he would have told Bomarito.
We emphasized to them additionally that the standards are alive and applicable, and our intention to use every authority and means at our disposal to assure that they are complied with.
So in looking to the future, the White House seems to be going all out in trying to keep this rubber settlement within bounds. It finessed the Teamster agreement. Now it seems to feel that it absolutely needs an example of no-nonsense, effective presidential discipline. Herbert Kaplow, ABC News, at the White House.
United Airlines and striking machinists will resume talks in Denver this Monday, a hopeful sign for the 160,000 people who usually fly United every day. The 3-week-old strike has kept other airlines jammed and made domestic air travel, very difficult. The interest rate on government-insured home mortgages is being raised from 9.5% to 10%. It's the first increase in FHA and VA loan rates since last June.
Terrorist incidents are not unusual in Rome these days, but early today, terrorists attacked one of the city's priceless works of art. A powerful bomb smashed in the main door of the beautiful old city hall designed by Michelangelo. Rome's communist mayor called it a crime against civilization and blamed right-wing fascists. In Moscow, Soviet President Leonid Brezhnev has pardoned 5 Soviet Jews who had been in prison since 1970 for trying to hijack an airplane out of Russia. The pardons coincide with the visit of U.S. congressmen who have made a point of insisting on greater freedom for Jews to emigrate in return for increased Soviet trade with the United States. Secretary of State Vance and Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin met again this afternoon, their second meeting in 2 days, to try to wrap up the new arms limitation treaty. Reportedly, the major issues have been resolved, but there are still some technical details to be worked out. Some officials are privately predicting that the long-awaited announcement of an agreement will be made next week. Now, part 5 of our special assignment series on American military strength. The purpose of the new SALT treaty is to limit strategic arms. But as Ted Koppel reports now, it may be necessary, even with the treaty, to produce one of the most expensive missile systems ever developed.
From the air, they're all but invisible. But one leg of this country's nuclear triad is buried under the fields of Montana and North Dakota, Wyoming, and right down there, under the plains of South Dakota.
There is some suggestion, though, that those land-based missiles are about to become, if not obsolete, at least dangerously vulnerable. It's a question of the Soviets having enough missiles with enough warheads, with enough accuracy and explosive power to destroy all or most of our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles with a first strike. One of the very few points on which most of the experts agree is that the Soviets will have this capability within the next 2 to 3 years. Having said that, there is very little agreement on what to do about it.
There is always the problem that they have to face that when we sense an attack of many missiles on our missiles, that we could, under some circumstances, decide to launch them before they were destroyed.
This option of launch on warning has serious defects.
It's an option that ought to be in the Soviet mind, but I do not believe it is a very good option. I think it is an option that leads to a hair trigger. We've had several false alarms with our system. The President of the United States would have only 10 or 15 minutes to make a crucial decision about whether he was going to be willing to subject the world to a nuclear holocaust.
When those land-based missiles become vulnerable, and it's estimated that by 1982 the Soviets will be able to take out up to 95% of them in a first strike, the system will still be defended by strategic bombers and submarine-launched ballistic missiles.
It's defended by the fact that knocking out that piece and killing some millions of U.S. civilians in the process, which is what I estimate would happen, will bring retaliation in kind. And so the Soviets ought to be deterred from that kind of attack. Now again, the difficulty is, that's my calculation. We don't know what their calculation is.
Someone may preempt, someone may make a move which is misjudged by the other side, and that could produce a war. The conclusion from that, therefore, is that you do not wish to let asymmetries develop, and you have to maintain essential equivalence in a broad spectrum of military relationships.
In other words, the United States should be able to either protect its own land-based missiles or, to restore the balance, be able to threaten the survival of Soviet land-based missiles. The United States is preparing to do both. For the defense of our missiles, two likely options: multiple protective shelters, a high-stakes version of the old shell game. Take a limited number of missiles and keep moving them among a much larger number of silos. As long as there are more silos than Soviet warheads, Moscow can never be sure of destroying all U.S. land-based missiles. Or the so-called air mobile system, specially designed aircraft which would serve quite literally as in-flight launch silos that would take off at the first warning of Soviet attack. The advantage of an air mobile system is that the aircraft carrying the missiles can be dispersed to more places than the Soviets could possibly target. But in connection with either one of these systems, the United States is developing an enormous new missile, the MX, bigger, more powerful, with more warheads than the Minuteman, as threatening to Soviet missile silos as anything they have aimed at ours. When that combined system is developed, the balance will shift in favor of the United States again, but it will be 6 or 7 years before a movable MX missile is an active element of the U.S. defense program, and it's only reasonable to expect that Soviet military development will not stand still. It's something of a logical wasteland. Unless the Carter administration commits itself to a survivable MX missile program, there probably won't be enough votes in the Senate to ratify a strategic arms limitation agreement, SALT II. But a movable MX missile would almost certainly worry the Soviet Union so much that they will feel the need to somehow counter it. Even in theory, neither side can afford to let the other believe that a nuclear exchange might be winnable. And so, the cycle begins again. Next week, we'll take a look at some of the more conventional ways that wars can be fought. This is Ted Koppel.
Actor Henry Fonda says doctors found what he calls a few malignant cancer cells when they operated on him earlier this week. But Fonda, who is 73, says no further treatment is planned, and he'll be back on stage soon. Another entertainer is talking about changing his career. Johnny Carson wants out of The Tonight Show, and today he told Barbara Walters why. Barbara?
Max, I talked with Johnny Carson this afternoon at his home in California. Amidst reports that Fred Silverman, president of NBC, had been desperately trying to hold him to his contract, Carson surprisingly revealed that he hadn't talked with Silverman in more than a month. Fred Silverman hasn't telephoned me since March 17th, Johnny said dryly. Not only that, neither Silverman nor anyone else from NBC called me after my appearance on the Academy Awards. No one called to say you were good or bad or anything I asked? Nope, he replied. No one. Was that why he wants to leave The Tonight Show? Is he mad? No, Johnny said. I've been thinking of it for some time. The difference is that I have now openly expressed my desire to leave The Tonight Show before the end of my 2-year contract. I haven't threatened to walk out. I've just said that I've been doing the program for 17 years, and I don't want to do it for 19. But would he stay at NBC until his contract ends in spring of 1981? Or might he, as rumored, go to another network, perhaps ABC? Here Johnny was vague. I'm not sure what my contract states, he said. I don't know if it's possible. But he didn't rule out the possibility of a change of networks. Will he leave The Tonight Show on October 1st, as reported? Probably not, Johnny said, but he doubted that he would be doing it past late fall, certainly not beyond the end of the year. Could NBC force him contractually to continue? No one can force a performer to work if he doesn't feel like it, Johnny said. And he continued, I honestly feel I brought everything I can to this program, and I don't think I can stay at the top of my efficiency any longer. I don't want to leave when I'm completely depleted. And he said, there are many other things I could do. Motion pictures, personal appearances, television specials. I do want to stay active in television. I just don't want to do a daily program, even though I realize I'm walking away from a lot of money. Finally, Johnny told me, I realize this is a bad time for NBC. I'm sorry the network is in trouble, but I didn't create the problems, and I don't feel like Benedict Arnold. As to his future, Johnny said it will be settled within the next 2 or 3 days.
Thank you, Barbara. That's our report on World News Tonight. For ABC News, good night.